Good morning. Yeah, we'll cut that out. That's a good lead in. All right, here we go. Welcome to another edition of Everybody Hates Cleveland.com, the podcast. Number 20. I like things that end in 0. It's been a very non-productive day here in North Carolina as I watched the British Open. Mike, are you a Zach Johnson fanatic?
He's my least favorite Johnson on tour, but I'm still a Zach Johnson fan. He's no Dustin, but I was content.
Do you think that Zach Johnson does less? No, I'm not going to go there. Sorry. Sorry. My bad. All right, let's start over. I got to remember to edit this on YouTube. I got to remember to edit this on YouTube.
Yeah, please do.
All right. Welcome to another edition of Everybody Hates Cleveland.com, the podcast. I am your host, Jim Pete, joined as always by my faithful tag team partner, Miggy Hattery. Michael, how you doing today? A little bit of British Open to start our fantastic Monday.
Yeah, good outcome, I suppose. I would have liked to have seen Spieth win, but nice to watch a little golf and not have much to do on a Monday, so we're going to stay here and talk about how frustrating the Indians are again.
Well, of course, we're now 3 games into our second half of the season. The Indians playing finishing up a very interesting weekend series against the Cincinnati Reds. I guess the good news as we head down this rabbit hole edition of EHC is that they took 2 of 3 from Cincinnati and won the Ohio Cup. Would you rank this up there with World Series trophy?
Right up there. I actually have a trophy that's similarly valuable from when I played T-ball when I was 10 years old, which I am really excited about. So we can move on from the Ohio Cup discussion.
Well, I guess the best way to talk about the series is they won a good game, they lost a good game, or they won a game, lost a game, and then did whatever it was they did yesterday's game in one of the weirdest, strangest games. And when we're talking about the Cleveland Indians and we talk weird and strange, they walked in 4 runs. I guess as we talk about the second half of the year and maybe not look at the Reds season or the Reds series as a microcosm of what could happen in the second half. Something's got to be done with this offense. Something's got to be done with this team for them to perform like an actual playoff team. So I guess my question is, where do we go from here? I mean, where do we start talking about this team? I don't see a clear trade, although, now we've got the Carlos Gomez discussion coming with Milwaukee coming into town. That's kind of a ridiculous trade to me, even though I've written about it. But what we've got, and let's start with the front office, and let's start with the manager, Mike, and let's talk real. Let's start with Terry Francona, and let's not mince any words here, as you've noted on our podcast for more than a year now. Francona is suspect with regards to how he handles certain situations with this team. We can talk bullpen. We can talk situational hitting. We can talk placement and batting order. Let's talk Francona. Let's get real. I mean, obviously he's one of the best managers in baseball in some respects, but is he costing this team tangible games?
Yes, absolutely he is. I guess I have lots of notes on this, so I don't know how to display them. I guess my first point would be if you look at this roster and don't see a top 10 roster in Major League Baseball, I would have to disagree with you. This is a really talented team. There's sequencing and there are very odd things that have happened in the first half, but it's hard to really look at this Indians roster and say, this is a team that should be 44 and 47, because it just isn't. The core is tremendously talented. The second piece would be there are some obvious things he does 7 days a week that just don't help you win, and that is hitting Mike Aviles and Francisco Lindor second pretty frequently. I believe it's over 35 times this year, and they get on base relatively infrequently. And this is not a knock on Lindor. Lindor has been all that you could expect for him to be so far. He is a tremendous defensive upgrade, but it's about having reasonable expectations, and his bat just isn't. It's not where it's going to be in the future, but he's still better than what we had at shortstop. So he's been great, but the lineup construction has been pretty bad, and it's hard to argue that that hasn't cost runs, and costing your team runs costs your team games. I guess the other piece is that I don't know who you blame this on. We can talk this out and flesh it out a bit. But the roster management of bench spots has been ultra confusing. Specifically, not getting a legitimate backup center fielder and playing an injured Michael Brantley in center field instead of a very, very bad Michael Bourne. And running out an 8-man bullpen with the best rotation in baseball, where the 8th man in the bullpen and the 7th man in the bullpen pitch about once every 2 weeks, instead of having Tyler Holt so you can platoon in center and have a legit backup outfielder. Those things cost your team games. We've seen it already with Aviles in the Chicago series. But you know what? Mikey does a pretty good job out there. So it's hard not to blame that on Francona a little bit when he says really, really, really dumb things like that. And I don't mean to rip Mike Aviles, because it isn't his fault that his manager made him do something he can't do. But unfortunately, be it Lindor hitting second, Aviles hitting second, or people playing positions they shouldn't be playing, I think we're seeing a lot of managers putting their players in bad situations to succeed, and that hurts.
Well, we've got 41 games in which Aviles or Lindor have hit second. Santana's got 30, but Lindor's closing quickly in on that. And before we've talked a little bit about this off the air. Before we continue down this path, let's look at Lindor real quick. When you hear a manager talk about having to talk to Francisco Lindor about running out balls to first base, I think if you were to talk to anybody who's watched Lindor in the minor leagues, running balls out to first base were never really an issue there. It's ended up a bit of a red flag for me. Could the frustration be getting to him of having the pressure of batting second in this lineup? Thinking about how a player like Lindor, looking at maybe comping him a little bit to Kipnis in the past, Lindor's a player who cares about winning and cares about helping this offense. It's been a struggling unit all year in some form or fashion. Could this frustration of having to bat second with all of this pressure on a two-hitter be affecting him in other areas and making this by all indicators, high impact personality do strange things like not running out balls to first base? I know that's a strange and odd connection, but there does seem to be kind of an unfair weight put on him batting second.
Yeah, you've led me in quite well. I have really significant concern, and I'm not sure how it's going to affect his development. But these things can affect development, and I think this is a roster that was clearly built to contend, has the parts to contend, and has struggled through the first half. And we have decided to rectify that by putting a glove-first player whose bat isn't there yet in the two-hole in a struggling offense. And I can't help but think that's good for him developmentally. And for someone who has carried pressure his whole career, this seems like a lot of unnecessary pressure, and one that just doesn't help the team and certainly doesn't help the player. And that's a really negative impact.
So, getting back to Francona and these moves that he makes, and utilizing Cody Allen maybe a little too much, and 8-man bullpen, and not having Holt, all these really obvious, people want to make it a metrics thing versus an old school thing. But the reality is these are pretty basic moves that a lot of teams don't make. What is it with Francona? He gets rid of Atchison, keeps the 8-man bullpen. We've got some pitchers in the bullpen that are suspect. The counter to all this is, how many wins does this cost us? And I guess over the long haul, Mike, what do you think? How many wins do these decisions cost a team like the Indians when you look at not having somebody back up, struggling, understatement, Michael Bourne, having to put in Brantley into center, and we talked about this in the last podcast. I mean, this really creates a snowball effect that, I guess the counter to all this talk about Francona not making good decisions. And again, I think we both agree that he's a really good manager in a lot of respects. But when he's making these suspect calls, what's the win total that we can expect this to cost the team with all these suspect decisions?
I think projecting a win total is really tough. One thing we could look at, I think, would be quickly we could do a DRS look at defensive runs saved, and then just look at the savings in center and the offensive costs. If we look at, for instance, the Santana being flipped to the two-hole rather than Lindor and Aviles, we have a 350 plus OBP swapped out for a 290 to 300 OBP, which means about once every 20 at bats, Santana will get on base more than them. So, it has some frequency value, and also he has a higher ISO and more power productivity than both. If you look at, for instance, the effect in center field, it hasn't been very positive. We have a negative DRS for Brantley and for Bourne, and whether Holt would be at 0. So there's 1 or 2 wins at the margins, and when the league is really, really congested, when there's no clear leap, you have 2 wild card systems, the cost of a couple wins is really, really large. So the estimating for each is really, really complex, but I feel comfortable saying tactically, there's 1 to 3 games at the margins that Francona loses, and that's unfortunate. And that's just where we are halfway through the season. So we'll see how it plays out, but it's definitely had a negative impact so far.
All right, so let's look at these decisions one at a time. Some of them we've talked about, some of them we haven't. Let's look at, and it's hard to talk about one without talking about the other. But when you have a logjam financially with guys like Swisher and Bourne on this team, taking up a massive amount of fiscal space, I guess is a good way to say it. What realistically, okay, we can't talk about center field without talking about the bullpen. So let's talk about both. Obviously, Holt should be up here, correct?
Correct. No doubt.
And obviously, we should have 1 less pitcher, correct?
Correct. No doubt.
So what's the deal with Terry Francona in this 8-man pen? Like, why does he feel with a rotation as good as the rotation that he has right now? And this is what confounds me, because you could make a case that in his 3 years here in Cleveland, we've had pretty consistently good pitching. The rotations have looked different over the 3 years. But this year in particular, we have, I would say, the best rotation in baseball. Now, we can discuss that between us and the Mets and some other teams. But at the very least, we have a rotation that goes deep into ball games. My question is, what is Francona's insistency on keeping 8 pitchers in the bullpen when you have a rotation that's this solid, top to bottom, 1 through 5, and the ability in reality that if you use up a bullpen, I mean, they could call up some guys and send down some guys to keep that bullpen fresh. What's the deal? Like, what am I missing?
I was really hoping that you would have an explanation for this. I certainly don't. One of the things that Francona is famous for and is sometimes lauded tactically and sometimes criticized is that bullpens to him in close games are bullets that you have to use up. And he uses a heck of a lot of bullets. And he uses Zeppo a lot. And he does a lot of matchup pitching. Sometimes to his detriment. I've seen him use Zeppo over McAllister when McAllister he's a functionally dominant reliever. And he and Allen shorten games in the back end. So I guess the other piece that's really interesting to me is not only a top 3 rotation or number 1 in baseball, the back 2 guys in the pen are dynamite, lights out. It's not like, you need to move pieces around a lot to do matchups in the final 2 innings. You have a dominant back end. So you essentially have 5 guys sitting around for maybe the 7th or the 6th inning. And if you're worrying about mopping up, doesn't matter how many guys you have in the pen, you're not getting good outcomes. So to me, the 8th guy in the pen is inexplicable. I don't like to use the term embarrassing because Terry Francona has been around this game for 40 years. I certainly have not. But Yeah, the 8-man pen, the spot could be empty and it could have the same impact on this team. I don't know what to say. It's inexplicable, and you got to fix it. And if you don't, whether Antonetti is not establishing himself enough in the decision-making tree, or whether Francona has too much power, that has to change, because you can't have an 8-man pen with this rotation and with the defensive struggles in the outfield. Can't do it.
We'll get to Antonetti, but let's talk usage here. You've got Cody Allen, Brian Shaw, Scrabble, all with 40-plus games. You've got McAllister at 35. You've got Hagedorn, who's now out likely for the season, at 36. So I guess here's again another issue I have. If you've got 8 men in the pen, why the hell do these guys get used so much?
Well, there's a style of thinking that frequent action is that of a strategic thinker. And I would suggest that these people are wrong, but Francona, when it comes to bullpen arms, believes that you're going to lose them if you don't use them. And, well, he doesn't believe that. I don't know what he believes.
So there you go. So this is the rabbit hole, because in theory, if you've got an 8-man pen, you're trying to save your top bullpen arms, but that's not what's happening. If you look back to last year, virtually an 8-man pen the whole season, you have your top 3 relievers all in the top, I want to say the top 15 in usage. This year, we've got 3 guys over 40 games. We're sitting at I don't know what mark we're at now, closing in on 90 games. If they're in every other game, like, what good is this 8-man pen doing us? It's not really doing us any good because it's not saving any bullpen arms.
Yeah, this is the piece too, and it seems like I'm really at a loss for words, and it's because the pure simplicity of how stupid this is so hard to continually voice. And I think this isn't an advanced data thing. A lot of these decisions, these are very clear, traditional, easy to understand baseball concepts that are going wrong consistently, that we are mismanaging. And once again, we're operating in thin margins where small decisions have impacts, especially in a really congested race, especially for the second wild card spot. So when it's this simple, it's really, really it's a bad face for the organization and for Francona, whoever you want to blame, that these decisions are getting made.
Well, and I think when you look at a team that does have the logjam in the outfield and on our bench that we have currently with Bourne and Swisher and the money that I talked about, you're dealing with kind of a hairline threat of mistake that you can make because, and we're dealing exactly with the problems that we're afraid of. We've got a hurt left fielder who's forced to play center. That's simplified by bringing up a guy like Holt, who defensively can play out there if you need him, who can play left field, play center, could let Brantley DH if he had to, could put Bourne on the bench permanently or in a platoon. It just seems too easy to me. Now, let's talk lineup here too, because we can't talk about the defense without the offense. The other piece to all of this, Mike, is that, we talked about this off air as well. You've got a lineup that, again, when you bring up 2 guys like Urshela and Lindor, you automatically know that offensively you could have struggle. At the very least, we've got 2 primarily defensive ball players in Urshela and Lindor. You know that maybe their offense comes around in years to come, but of course you can't expect these guys to carry weight. So even if you don't have them at second, let's say you plug them down at 8-9, automatically you're going to have a bit of a hole offensively. When you continually run out these lineups, offensively, that causes struggle, especially when you've got 2 guys who almost automatically as rookies are going to struggle a bit. So why, again, aren't we making these obvious moves? I know Holt's not exactly a 300 hitter, but this is a guy who came up and performed pretty well last year. He's been performing exceedingly well in AAA, and I know it's Columbus. I know we can't overstate that enough. But in a bare minimum, might even be an improvement offensively. I mean, I just think that there's these obvious things that we're missing.
Yeah, he's a significant improvement, whether certainly in a platoon role. I think a platoon role with Bourne, with Holt getting time defensively and hitting against left-handed pitching, improves them offensively and defensively, or at least maintains defensively and certainly improves them offensively. And him as a fill-in in left field or in right field on days off is a significant improvement over Aviles or Rayburn having to play out there instead of DHing. So each of these is an improvement. Logic is, looking for reasons is impossible. There aren't any. It's a joke.
All right. So I think the obvious move here is to get rid of one of those pen arms. This isn't, to anyone who's listening, this isn't going to be a surprise, and bring up Holt. And, Mike, we've been talking about how good Holt is for years now. And, jumping on the bandwagon isn't really what we're doing here. This is something we've been talking about for a couple years. The kind of player that Holt is lends itself well to the fourth outfielder spot. And there's a little bit of upside there where he could potentially be a guy to start, dependent on, what happens once he's actually with the club. So there's the easy fix. And you talk about a maybe 1 to 3 game cost with regards to the Indians. And I'm not going to get into the Francona bounce as far as what he does for this team in the locker room, but I do want to talk a little bit about the locker room manager that he is, only because you've touched upon this in several podcasts, and I want you to kind of talk about this right now. Is when you get a guy like Francona and you pay him the kind of money that they do. I mean, it's almost like having an all-star signing when you pay him the kind of money that he's getting paid to be that locker room guy. You look at a guy specifically like Mike Aviles, and you look at a guy specifically like Nick Swisher, and we'll call it the Giambi principle. When you have a guy like Francona, isn't it redundant to have some of these locker room guys?
Yeah, so when you have Giambi, Atchison, Aviles, all of these guys, my general feeling is when these guys become irreplaceable, when beat writers write articles about how important these guys are to stabilize the locker room, and when my manager struggles tactically on a day-to-day basis but is a renowned players manager, an ESPN poll is published which says that he is a top 2 players manager in terms of handling the clubhouse, I wonder why I have to stack my roster with 1 or 2 guys every year who are replacement level players in order to stabilize the locker room. And it really concerns me. And I think if that's necessary for Francona to retain the locker room and control the locker room, I have concerns. Now, obviously, this podcast, I come off as someone who thinks that the Indians should fire Francona tomorrow, and that's not true. I think Francona is probably one of the 10 best managers in the game, and I think a lot of people struggle with decisions at the margins. But I think there is an infallibility to Francona that may have been earned or people may feel deserved that I don't necessarily think is the case. And I think, there have been some issues. And I think if we reach the end of the season with a 500 record with this sort of talent on the roster, significant criticism for the slump should sit in Francona's court because he's slumped as much as this team has this season.
Well, and I think, when we talked about this is, when you look at a team that starts off with 92 wins with the roster that he's given with a couple of tweaks to it, Yan Gomes, Mike Aviles was added to that team, if I remember correctly. Not really a whole lot else. Mark Reynolds was added to that team, Nick Swisher and Michael Bourne. Obviously, you could probably point to the biggest factors that they added, but they won 92 games that year. Last year, they won 85. This year, they're under 500. And will have to play out of their they'll have to play with like they're on a rocket ship to win 85 games, let alone 90 that we predicted would be their amount of wins they'd have to win to get in the playoffs in the beginning of the year. So if they win 81 games, I mean, you're looking at a team that's got diminishing return over the past 3 years, and there's a lot that goes into that. So the question will become, and I'm curious about this, 92 games, 85 games, 81 games. Let's be hypothetical. Let's say they win 81 games or 79 or 80. We can talk about how many games that Francona brings to this team. But again, at the end of 3 seasons, might we have a good case that he's cost this team more than he's helped this team? And again, I want to preface all this. I think Mike and I both I'm definitely a Terry Francona guy. I mean, let's not mince words, but there comes a point where you have to question strategy. Mike, you've been doing it pretty steadily for the past, since you've always been a guy to question things. And you've been a pretty steady critic of some of the moves that Francona's made over the years. But, this is getting, in a season like this, when we're not winning more than we're losing, it gets to be a big deal. And you do have to ask that question, don't you?
Absolutely. And it's really challenging to look at this roster and look at the last 2 years' rosters and say those rosters were a lot better than this one. In fact, this roster, to me, we have the Gomes and Brantley injuries, which seem to be sapping their production. But it's pretty hard to enter this season and say, hey, Jason Kipnis is going to be an MVP candidate and not expect them to be a playoff contender. It's really, really hard not to have that expectation based on having an elite rotation, an above-average bullpen, and 5 to 6 position players who are average to above average. It's really hard to look at this roster and say, this is a below 500 team. Now, there's some different things that feed into that, absolutely. There's some randomness, there's some sequencing, and there's some composition pieces, but really it's a tough bill of goods to sell that this team isn't as good as those 2 previous teams.
Well, and let's there's a lot of people pointing to certain guys, and this Santana talk to me, it's tiring. It's tiring on both sides. It's obviously not Santana's fault. It's obviously more of a 25-man roster and a limited small market team. We've got the roster we've got. If we make a move and it's a big one, it's going to cost us. So we've got the team we got. It's not a Santana thing. It's not a Jason Kipnis thing. Looking at some extremes, it's not a Michael Bourne thing or a Nick Swisher thing. With this roster in this market, Mike, doesn't the manager have to hit on more things than miss? Let's just be right down to it. You've got to hit everything, or at least let's just throw a percentage out there. And this is probably a low percentage. But in this market, as a manager, don't you have to hit on 75% of the moves that you make? And that's probably low.
I absolutely think when we're talking about roster margins, you have to hit on a lot, and you cannot afford to waste roster spots. Right now, the Indians are wasting 1 or 2 roster spots. You just simply cannot afford to do that, especially when in system you have cost-effective options who make your team better, and you're not making them. I think we can't cut $15.8 million like the Cubs did, but we can certainly cut $500,000 and call up Holt, and it's going to make us better. Or someone else. But there's certainly ways to improve this team that they're not making, and when the margins are this thin, you've got to make the right calls, and they're just not.
So let's bring the front office into this. And I want to preface all of this with the fact that, they're not going to fire Francona, and we're not pushing for that whatsoever. It's just, I think too often when you talk about this baseball team, people kind of walk the fence or either fly over the fence half cocked. I want to kind of balance this conversation with the realistic piece to all this, that Terry Francona brings a certain moxie to this team. And again, you can't measure moxie, and I'm not trying to say that counterbalances his bad moves. I'm just saying that there's more to Terry Francona than these questionable items on this team, which brings me to this relationship that he has with both Chris Antonetti and Mark Shapiro. And I think, Mike, the big thing that I've had with this relationship, it's a positive thing. They get along. You can see that these 3 have a game plan and goals, and they want this team to win a championship. And it's good to see them, sitting in the war room, during that Trevor Bauer move 2 years ago. And it's good to see them agreeing on a lot of things behind the scenes. That said, let's talk to day-to-day operations of this team. At some point, you have to question a relationship between a general manager and a manager when that general manager isn't putting his foot down a little more than he should. And let me connect this to John Hart and Mike Hargrove. Hargrove being a manager who walked into Cleveland with a lot less credibility than Terry Francona, and John Hart equally so, coming into that general managership as a guy who really never held a major position. I mean, probably the biggest position he'd held up to that point was managing the Indians for 19 games. But Hart was never afraid to call Mike Hargrove on moves. When he wanted Manny Ramirez in the lineup, he went into the office and told Mike Hargrove, "I'm sorry, but Manny Ramirez isn't going down to the minor league system." At what point do we point fingers both at Francona and at Antonetti for not doing the same? Or let me back up a second. Is it possible that Antonetti is putting his foot down and Francona is just ignoring him? Does Francona have that much clout?
Yeah, I have significant concerns that based on Francona's resume, which is a very, very strong resume, that when he was brought into Cleveland, the deal was very, very nice in terms of what sort of organizational influence he could have around making decisions. This is someone who historically went head-to-head with Epstein about regular day-to-day decisions about whether Mike Lowell would play in a Sunday night baseball game based on platoon splits or what have you. So I think we obviously can't see inside what the relationship is like, but having seen how this organization operates, their hirings, what the organization values, having historically the strongest database system in Major League Baseball, one that predates the A's collective system. I think it's really easy to see that Antonetti is a very analytically minded general manager, and that likely some of these roster management moves don't reflect what you would expect from him. So I'm concerned that either Francona has a control over the fringes of the roster that shouldn't be allowed and isn't a part of a good working relationship where both parties are valued, or Antonetti is challenged in asserting what he thinks needs to be done.
Well, and therein lies the problem when you look at a team like the Cleveland Indians, is I think there's a few different things here at play when you talk about the fringe part of this lineup and you talk about the constrictions of the front office with the moves they can make. You need to make sure that the manager is performing at 100%. And, we've made comparisons. I think a lot of people like to make comparisons with Terry Francona and his relationship with Theo Epstein and his relationship with both Shapiro and Antonetti. And Mike, talk a little bit about that. I know, in the analytics world, Theo Epstein is one of the guys that is pointed to as being fairly brilliant, and I would concur with that. Of course, brought a world title to Boston, brought in Terry Francona to begin with. My question to you is, we'll talk a little bit about his relationship with Epstein, and you've done some research on this, and we've talked about this. It was an interesting relationship, but one out of respect. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, just from reading, and it's tough too, because once again you're reading into margins. Thankfully, the Boston media is a little more piercing in these relationships, though in terms of questioning how decisions are made, and something that our media doesn't do a ton. But from everything that I've read and kind of heard through the grapevine and so forth. Epstein and the analytics department essentially would have regular kind of confrontations with Francona, and they weren't always won by the analytics department, and the analytics department wasn't always right. But the key was that they were having these conversations, they could still work with each other, and it was clear that both were influencing the other in day-to-day decisions and were creating a shared vision for how to move the roster forward and how to succeed. And I think when you look at the Indians roster and how we make decisions, it seems like a more traditionally run franchise, though the front office is one that makes decisions on the edge of analytics and sabermetrics, one that has hired the strongest of names from many different research institutes, well, not institutes, but baseball research factories for the past 3 years, past 10 years, and has one of the strongest databases in Major League Baseball, from which almost all Major League Baseball analytics databases are kind of built in homage to. So I think there's something where the relationship where they can challenge each other doesn't seem to be there, and it seems like Francona's winning every decision.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting conundrum because, you know, you've got to give Francona some leeway. I mean, regardless of what people will say, when you win 2 World Series, and that does carry weight. The flip side to that is winning a World Series in Boston and coming to Cleveland are 2 different scenarios. And I think we both can agree, while Epstein metrically is brilliant. I mean, obviously, his success rate in Boston and what seems to be happening in Chicago is unquestioned. But when you're in Boston, you have the ability to kind of pad your team a little bit. You have a little bit more money to deal with. And some of these mistakes can be hidden behind a lineup that includes in their prime Ortiz, one of the greatest right-handed hitters of all time, and Manny Ramirez. Could it be that Francona's career in Boston was hidden a little bit by Theo on one side and this just magnificent offensive lineup on the other?
I think this is one of the problems with attributing success in World Series championships to a manager. Absolutely. You know, these were supremely talented rosters, huge payrolls, which paled only in comparison to New York payrolls, and ones where Boston was still kind of on the edge analytically. So I think he had a tremendously talented roster, and I think he was also a tremendous voice in Boston. I think he's one that steadied players in a really challenging media market in which players get brutalized and often are forced out of that media market. I think his cool, calm, relaxed, I want to be a friend manager technique may have been a complete necessity to taking a really talented team to a World Series. I'm not necessarily as sold that that's a really essential skill set in Cleveland. And I'm not completely sold that I'm going to be a player's friend, player manager style works really well when making decisions with veteran players. I think it's really hurt Francona in this roster. So I think, you know, there's some differences, and I think some of his success in all those winning seasons that are all attributed to him are as much due to the roster he had as his ability, but he's still a fine manager. It's just that we ascribe a lot of success to managers when they're not playing and in a game where the sole decisions they make are the lineup cards. He's not calling a lot of plays.
Well, you know, and it's easy to talk about Francona, the Francona effect in Boston. And, you know, let's not forget that the year before they brought in Francona was the Grady Little year in which they were up 3-0 on the Yankees and then lost 4 in a row. It's not like he was given the shepherd stick in Boston and had to carry that team a whole lot further than Grady Little had them kind of leaning on the precipice. And again, this is not to take away from Terry Francona. I just want a more real picture. That's really my goal here with EHC and with everything else, is to get a real clear picture of what we're looking at. Again, I love Terry Francona. I mean, bringing Terry Francona here to Cleveland was brilliant. It was a great move coming off of Manny Acta. Got this team 92 wins, that wonderful stretch down the stretch in 2013 that put them in the playoffs, even if it was for only 1 game. But the question does become, you know, what point does Terry Francona have to alter what he's doing to fit the roster that he has? We keep talking about roster configuration. For crying out loud, Mike, since this site has been built last June, we've been talking about roster configuration. And at some point, Terry Francona has to manipulate the roster in a different way. He can't be the same manager that he was in Boston. He can't be the same manager that he was in 2013, when our biggest issue in 2013 was keeping starters healthy and getting rid of Jason Giambi. You know, our roster is more talented, but I would say that this year, more than last year and the year before especially, we're a lot more locked. We've got more quote-unquote Giambis this year, especially when Swisher comes off the DL. So will Terry Francona make the correct moves to make this team, to put this team in best position to win? And by that, I'm not talking about trades. I mean, it's hard to isolate roster movement within the confines of our 40-man. Do you have enough confidence in Terry Francona over the next 2.5 months that he can make the appropriate moves under the configuration of the team as it stands now, not likely to make trades or do something minor, do you think he's going to ultimately alter this roster, or are we going to get proven wrong? And is he going to continue down this path and end up winning games, or are we just going to end up where we're at right now, either right around 500 or a little bit below?
I would say that the Indians, I would expect get better outcomes and better results and have a winning record in the second half, but I don't think that Francona is going to change the decision-making issues that he has and better utilize this roster. And that could be costly, and the margins are already really, really thin. And I think that this team, it's still tight. They can compete for that second wild card. This team is loaded with talent, so I think the outcomes will definitely improve. I think there'll be 5 to 7 games over 500, but I think we will be talking in September about why Tyler Holt should have been there 4 months ago. We'll be talking in September about why Francisco Lindor shouldn't be batting second, and he should be batting 8th or 9th. And we'll be talking in September about Nick Swisher being dead weight that should never be rostered. So can't wait to have that conversation, and I'll be even more frustrated than I am now.
Well, and as we close up this podcast, I do want to again take note. When you're not winning baseball games the way that you should, and Mike said it best. I mean, he's been adamant from day one that this was an extremely talented baseball team, and it really is. If you go position by position, the starting lineup, especially now with Lindor and Urshela here, and we can get into them maybe in our next podcast, talk a little bit about where they're at, both offensively and defensively in their early major league careers. But, I think when you have a team as talented as this Indians team is, in a division like this, and again, the fact that we're still talking about the Tigers being ahead of us, and I know it's less now than it was, 5 weeks ago. But the fact is the Tigers have owned us. We've lost games we should have won, and I just, I think it's time as Indians fans that we just step back and make sure we're seeing the clear picture, and not just adhering to I'm old school or I'm a metrics guy, but understanding that there's a lot of sides to the coin to look at. And we here at EHC are always going to be that way. That's why the writers that we have on this site speak their minds. Whether I agree with it, Mike agrees with it, or any of our writers agree with it, I want all those opinions out there because truthfully, all of them have merit. And I think looking at Francona and being realistic with Francona is something that should be done. It should be done by any good front office. Boston did it, and they decided they needed to go in a different direction. They went with Bobby Valentine. Oops. But then they ended up riding the ship with John Farrell. I'm not saying that's what the Indians need to do, but any good front office, and listen, you can say what you want about Chris Antonetti. He makes good moves. But, Mike, I mean, to kind of wrap things up, shouldn't any good front office, day to day, month to month, talk about what their manager is and isn't doing? And shouldn't they make an impact with that? I mean, we've talked about the conversations, but this is what every good front office should do, correct?
Correct.
So we'll leave it there. And if you got a problem with it, great. If not, great. Comment. Keep coming to our site. We'll be provocative. And if you don't like it, well, there's tons of other sites you can go see. With that said, this is Jim Pete signing off for this podcast. Who knows what we'll talk about next? Perhaps we'll talk about trading Lindor and Urshela for Scott Atchison. I joke. Go Tribe.